The town waited for two legends to kill each other. Hands hovered over holsters. Dust hung in the air. Then something neither man expected stepped into the street. In the summer of 1878, the desert town of Red Hollow woke earlier than usual. By sunrise, the street was already filling with people who pretended they had errands. Shopkeepers stood in their doorways longer than necessary. Miners who had ridden in overnight leaned against hitching posts, saying very little. Even the church bell rang slower that morning, as if the town itself understood something important was about to happen. Two men were coming, not strangers, not drifters, legends. For weeks, rumors had moved through saloons and stagecoach stops like wildfire. The story was always the same. Two of the most dangerous gunmen in the territory had finally agreed to settle their unfinished business. One was Caleb Rourke, a quiet man with a reputation carved into half the frontier. Some said he had been a lawman once. Others said he had been something worse. What everyone agreed on was simple: Caleb Rourke never drew his revolver unless he meant to use it. The other was Victor Hawley. Hawley didn't hide from his reputation. Where Rourke was silent, Hawley was theatrical. He walked into towns like he owned them. Fast hands, cold smile. And a trail of men who had once believed they were faster. Their story stretched back nearly 10 years. A failed job. A missing bag of gold. 3 dead men in the desert, and 2 survivors who blamed each other. Since then, the West had been waiting for the moment when Rourke and Hawley would stand across from one another in a dusty street. Hands resting near worn revolvers. The air tight with the promise of gunfire. That moment had finally arrived. By mid-morning, Red Hollow was silent. Windows filled with watching eyes. Horses tied along the street shifted nervously in the heat. The wind pushed small spirals of dust between the buildings, like ghosts wandering through town. Then someone spotted a rider approaching from the west. Caleb Rourke. He rode slowly, like a man with nowhere else to be, and somewhere beyond the eastern ridge. Another rider was already on his way. Victor Hawley. By noon, the street between them would become the most dangerous place in the entire territory, and the whole town intended to watch. Long before Red Hollow ever heard their names whispered with fear. Caleb Rourke and Victor Hawley rode the frontier as partners. In those days, the West was still wide and unfinished. Law was thin, towns were fragile, and men with steady hands and fast instincts could make a living in ways that didn't always fit inside the rules. Rourke had once worn a badge, not for long. Just long enough to learn that justice and survival rarely rode the same horse. He left the job quietly, keeping the discipline of a lawman but none of its protection. Hawley was different. Where Rourke was cautious, Hawley was ambitious. He enjoyed the reputation, the whispers when he walked into a saloon. He believed the West belonged to men bold enough to take it. Somehow the two men balanced each other. Rourke handled the planning. Hawley handled the risk. For nearly 3 years, they rode together as bounty hunters across the territories. They tracked killers through canyon trails, dragged fugitives out of gambling halls, and delivered more than a few men to courthouse steps with iron cuffs on their wrists. Their partnership became known. People said, if Rourke was tracking you, you were already halfway caught. But if Hawley was riding beside him, you might not make it to court at all. The job that broke them came in the winter of 1870. A railroad company had quietly placed a bounty on a gang that had been robbing supply wagons along the southern routes. The gang's leader, an outlaw named Marcus Delaney, had vanished into the desert with a small crew and a heavy sack of stolen gold. The reward for bringing him in was enormous. Rourke and Rourke took the job. For nearly 2 weeks, they tracked Delaney's gang through dry riverbeds and broken canyon passes. The trail ended in a narrow stretch of desert known as Black Sand Ridge. That's where everything fell apart. Gunfire echoed through the rocks before sunrise. Horses scattered. Dust and smoke swallowed the camp. When the shooting stopped, 3 men from Delaney's crew were dead. Marcus Delaney was gone, and the sack of railroad gold had disappeared. Only 2 men rode away from Black Sand Ridge that morning: Caleb Rourke and Victor Hawley. No one else saw what happened there. But when the 2 men reached the next town, they were no longer partners, Rourke claimed. Hawley had tried to steal the gold during the chaos. Hawley claimed Rourke had turned on the gang too early and ruined the entire job. Neither man could prove his story, but the West didn't care about proof. All it cared about was the outcome. 3 corpses in the desert, a fortune that vanished without a trace, and 2 gunfighters who would never ride together again. 4 years afterward, whenever their names were spoken, in the same room, the conversation always ended the same way. One day, someone would ask the question everyone was thinking. When Rourke and Hawley finally meet again, which one walks away? Asterisk, by the time the sun reached its highest point over Red Hollow, the entire town had gathered along the edges of the street. No one stood in the middle. That stretch of dust between the buildings had become sacred ground, the kind that only 2 men were meant to walk. Caleb Rourke arrived first. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped into the street without hurry. His coat hung heavy against the heat, and the revolver at his side showed years of careful use. The grip was worn smooth, the leather holster darkened by time. Rourke didn't look at the crowd. He simply walked to the center of the road and stopped. The wind dragged a thin ribbon of dust across his boots. Then he waited. From the far end of town, a second rider appeared. Victor Hawley, even at a distance. There was something theatrical about him. His black coat caught the sunlight as he dismounted, handing the reins of his horse to a stable boy who looked too terrified to breathe. Hawley stepped into the street with the confidence of a man who had already imagined this moment 1,000 times. The crowd shifted slightly along the wooden sidewalks. 2 legends were finally standing in the same town, and now they were walking toward each other. Bootsteps echoed slowly across the dirt. Neither man rushed. Rourke's eyes remained steady, studying Hawley, the way a hunter studies an old scar on the land, something familiar, but dangerous. Hawley smiled faintly. "You took your time getting here," he called across the distance. Rourke didn't smile. "Figured you'd leave before I arrived." A few nervous chuckles came from somewhere in the crowd, quickly swallowed by silence. They stopped about 20 feet apart, the perfect distance. Far enough to measure a draw, close enough that neither man could miss. The wind faded, even the horses along the hitching posts had gone still. Hawley tilted his head slightly, studying the man he had once ridden beside across half the frontier. 10 years, he said quietly. "Did you that long to decide?" "I stole your gold." Rourke's voice stayed calm. "I already decided." Hale's smile hardened. "You always did like pretending you were the honest one." A ripple of tension moved through the watching crowd. Everyone knew the story. Black Sand Ridge, 3 bodies in the desert, gold that vanished like smoke. But no one knew the truth. Rourke's hand rested loosely near his revolver. "Tell me something," he said. "You spend all that gold already?" Hale's eyes darkened. "You still think I took it?" "I know someone did." For a moment, neither man moved. The sun pressed down harder. Sweat gathered under hats. A woman watching from the saloon doorway slowly covered her mouth with one hand. This was the moment that West had been waiting for. 2 gunfighters, 20 feet of dust, and a story that had been waiting 10 years to end. Halle lowered his voice. You really want to know what happened that morning? Rourke didn't blink. Draw, he said, and the street held its breath. For a moment, nothing moved. 2 men, 2 revolvers, 20 feet of dust between them. Victor Hale's fingers flexed slowly near the grip of his gun. Caleb Rourke's hand hovered just above his holster. Steady as stone, everyone in Red Hollow was waiting for the same sound. The draw, the gunfire, the end. Hale's smile faded as he studied Rourke's face. You're serious? He said quietly. Rourke didn't answer. The wind shifted through the empty street, brushing past the wooden storefronts and stirring loose dust around their boots. Halle shook his head slightly. You know what the funny thing is? He said. He spent 10 years chasing a lie. Rourke's eyes narrowed. You expect me to believe that? I expect you to listen. For the first time since stepping into the street, Hale's hand moved away from his revolver. The crowd murmured nervously. Halle continued, his voice low enough that only Rourke could hear clearly. That gold from Black Sand Ridge? Neither of us took it. Rourke's jaw tightened. Then where is it? Halle didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced past Rourke, toward the far side of Town Award, the church, at the end of the street. You remember Delaney's youngest boy? Halle asked. Rourke's expression hardened slightly. There had been a boy in that camp. 14, maybe 15. Too young to be part of a gang, but old enough to carry a rifle. Rourke had told him to run when the shooting started. Halle nodded slowly. He didn't run, Halle said. Rourke's voice dropped. What are you talking about? Halle looked back at him. That kid dragged the gold out of the camp while we were shooting each other's shadows. The words settled between them like a second kind of gunfire. For the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, Caleb Rourke took his brother boy, he said. Halle gave a quiet shrug. Not a boy anymore. Rourke followed Hale's gaze toward the church at the far end of town. The wooden doors were open, and a lone figure had just stepped out into the sunlight. Walking slowly toward that first, most of the town didn't understand what they were seeing. The figure walking out from the church moved slowly, almost cautiously, like someone stepping into a place that had once frightened him. He wasn't armed, at least not visibly. He wore a plain coat, dusted from travel, and a hat pulled low over his eyes. The sunlight caught the edge of his face as he stepped into the open street, revealing a man somewhere in his mid-20s. Young, but not a boy anymore. Caleb Rourke turned slightly, his attention shifting for the first time since the standoff began. Victor Halle watched the approaching figure with a strange calm. Well, Halle said quietly, looks like he finally decided to show himself. The murmuring crowd parted slowly along the sidewalks as the young man walked between them. People stepped back instinctively, unsure why they suddenly felt uneasy. He stopped about 30 feet away from the 2 gunslingers, not close enough to interrupt, but close enough to be heard. For a long moment, no one spoke. The man's eyes moved between Rourke and Halle. Recognition flickered across his face. You both look older, he said. His voice carried easily across the silent street. Rourke studied him carefully. The shape of the face was familiar. The same sharp jaw, the same dark eyes. He remembered from the camp at Black Sand Ridge. Only, now, those eyes carried something heavier. Memory, you're Delaney's boy? Rourke said. The young man nodded once. My name's Thomas, he replied. Thomas Delaney. A quiet ripple moved through the watching townspeople. Victor. Holly tipped his hat slightly. Didn't think you'd show up today, Holly said. Thomas glanced at him briefly. I didn't think you two would actually go through with this. Rourke's voice hardened. You took the gold. Thomas didn't deny it. I moved. He corrected. Rourke took a slow step forward. 10 years, he said. 10 years men have been killing each other over that gold. Thomas held his ground, I know. The silence that followed felt heavier than the desert heat. Hallie crossed his arms casually, watching the exchange like a spectator. So, Hallie said, you planning to tell him the rest? Thomas looked back at Rourke. There's a reason I took it, he said. Rourke's hand remained near his revolver, but he didn't draw. What reason could possibly be worth all this? Thomas inhaled slowly. Then he said the one thing that made the entire street feel suddenly smaller. Because that gold was never meant to be stolen. Rourke frowned. It belonged to the railroad. Thomas shook his head. No. His eyes drifted briefly toward the church behind him. That gold was blood money. The wind returned to the street. And suddenly, the duel that had brought the whole town together no longer felt like the real story. The street of Red Hollow had been waiting all morning for Gunfire instead. It got the truth. Thomas Delaney stood between two of the most dangerous interests men the frontier had ever known, speaking calmly while the entire town listened. The railroad didn't lose that gold, Thomas said. They were moving it. Rourke's brow tightened. Moving it where? Thomas gestured toward the dry hills beyond town. 2 pay men who burned 3 farming settlements along the southern route. A ripple of confusion moved through the watching crowd. Victor Hale's smile had disappeared. Thomas continued. The railroad wanted the land cleared for their tracks. The farmers refused to sell. So they paid a crew to make the problem disappear. Rourke's voice dropped lower. You're saying Delaney's gang stole the gold to stop that? Thomas nodded once. My father wasn't robbing them. He was. Taking back money meant to pay killers. The words hung in the air. For years, the story had been simple. A gang robbed the railroad. 2 bounty hunters chased them. 3 men died. Gold vanished. Asterisk, asterisk. But now the story sounded very different. Rourke's eyes shifted slowly toward Haley. You knew this? He asked. Haley didn't answer right away. Instead, he let out a quiet breath and looked down at the dust between his boots. I figured it. Out that morning, Haley finally said. Rourke's expression hardened. And you didn't think to mention it? Haley met his gaze. You were already shooting? The memory returned instantly. Gunfire in the gray light, before sunrise, shadows. Moving between the rocks, confusion, smoke, horses screaming. Rourke had believed Haley was betraying him. Haley had believed. Rourke had panicked. Both of them had been wrong. Thomas spoke again when the shooting started. I dragged the gold out of the camp while you two were busy trying to kill each other. Haley gave a quiet laugh. Kid moved faster than both of us. Rourke ignored him. Where is it now? He asked. Thomas turned slightly and looked back toward the church. Under the floor, the crowd murmured louder this time. That gold. Paid for the church, Thomas continued. The schoolhouse. The well outside town. Rourke glanced toward the buildings around them. You spent stolen money building half this town? Thomas shook his head. No. His voice was steady. I returned it to the people it was meant to destroy. Silence swallowed the street again. Rourke slowly looked back at Holly. 10 years. 10 years of anger. 10 years believing the man standing across from him had betrayed him for gold. Holly tilted his head slightly. So, he said, almost casually, You still planning to shoot me? Rourke studied him. The wind lifted dust between them. Every person in red. Hollow waited for the decision. But something had changed. The reason for the duel had just vanished. Rourke's hand slowly moved away. From his revolver, Hawley noticed for the first time all morning. Victor Hawley smiled again. Good, he said. Because I was getting tired of waiting. Asterisk for several long seconds. No one in Red Hollow moved. The town had gathered to watch two legends kill each other. Instead, they watched something far stranger. Both men stepped back. Caleb Rourke lowered his hand completely from his revolver and let it rest at his side. The tension that had filled the street all morning began to loosen, like a rope finally cut free. Victor Hawley exhaled slowly and glanced around at the watching crowd. Well, he said quietly, this is probably the most disappointed audience I've ever had. A few nervous laughs slipped through the silence. Rourke ignored the crowd. His eyes remained fixed on Hawley. 10 years, Rourke said. All because neither of us asked the right question. Hawley shrugged lightly. That's the West. He adjusted his coat and stepped aside, turning his back to the exact place where the duel should have happened. The dust between them remained untouched. No gunfire. No bodies. Just empty space where history had expected blood. Thomas Delaney watched both men carefully. You could still fight, he said. No one would stop you. Rourke shook his no. Point Hall nodded in agreement. Turns out we were both chasing the wrong enemy. The wind drifted through Red Hollow again, carrying the sound of creaking signs and restless horses. Slowly, people began stepping away from the street, whispering to one another. The duel that was supposed to become legend had ended before it. Evid began. Caleb Rourke walked back to his horse. Victor Hawley moved toward the saloon, pushing the swinging doors open like any ordinary afternoon. And the dusty space between them remained quiet, holding a story the West would talk about for years. Not the fastest draw, not the deadliest gunfight, but the duel that never happened. Sometimes the most dangerous battles aren't fought with guns. They're fought with pride, silence, and the stories men choose to believe. In the West, legends were often built on half-truths, and sometimes the real enemy was the past itself. If you enjoy dark, untold stories from the frontier, subscribe to Whispers of the West and join us for the next forgotten legend waiting in the dust.